get you all on your feet, please, and a round of applause for Tony Zappala.
Thanks, David.
How are you?
Good, thanks. Good evening, everyone.
So over the last couple of days, when I was chatting to some people about the fact that we're doing this event, and I was hosting you and I was going to be interviewing you, I kind of said, I'm going to be bringing Tony Zappala down, and people put their hand on my shoulder and kind of said in a concerned voice, he's very smart, David. Slightly worried about me and how I was going to fare and survive here, so no pressure. But
so, okay, this smart, and with Gene from the Bank of Ireland called me the money man. So
yeah, absolutely.
Pressure is on.
So, just to start off, sort of a status update about yourself. Tony Zappala, you're a partner with Highland Capital Partners in Europe. What is Highland Capital Partners Europe, and what do you do there? Right.
Sure. So Highland Europe is a venture capital fund. We invest in technology businesses across Europe. Slight twist is we only invest at what we call a growth stage. So it's not the stereotypical three guys in a garage kind of scenario, but it's businesses which have already gotten past that phase. They typically got to somewhere between 20 and 100 people. Real customers paying several millions per year to these businesses, and they're going, oops, we're almost becoming a real company, what do we do next? And I guess what we feel is historically there's been a lot of those situations where companies would sell out too early. There's a big opportunity, but it's already been 5-6 years of hard grind, and an offer comes along. It's enough to, life-changing amounts of money for the founders. In some cases, it's a good thing to do to take that offer. We feel in other situations there's actually a lot more potential to go on and try and be more ambitious, more Silicon Valley, let's say, maybe raise more money. In some cases, take a little bit of money off the table and pay off those mortgages and get some recognition for the grind, and get energized for the next 5 years. And so typically we'll invest anywhere between 10 and 30, 40 million in each company. Highland Europe is sort of descended from Highland Capital in the US, which is a Boston firm. What we did in 2012 was we raised the first dedicated European fund with a dedicated European team and just looking at Europe. And this year we've just raised our second fund, so in total we've got somewhere around 600 million euros to invest. And so far we've made
600 million, so he is the money guy.
So far we've made 16 investments, only one in Ireland.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that later on. So that's where you are now. Let's go all the way back. Tony in Cambridge, Tony in Seattle. So you were smart. You studied in computer science. That was your MSc
yes,
in Cambridge.
I studied information engineering.
Okay. And did you see at some point in those years in Cambridge, was there an aspiration to get into this space, or were you sort of, I'm going to be tinkering with electronics and IT for the rest of my career?
Not at all. So I got into it probably by mistake, because a lot of these things happened. I initially wanted to program, to code. I started working in a research center for Xerox at the time. I was attracted by the Palo Alto Research Center, history, invented a mouse, all that kind of stuff. Started working on a project which had been going already for about 5 or 6 years, which was a virtual desk. When I joined, it was clear that they were at least another 5-6 years away from anything which would ever be a product. There didn't seem to be anything which was a driver for doing this other than just the beauty of research. And I think I got a little bit frustrated by that, and it made me wonder, who's making the decisions, why are we doing this? And at that point I decided to go more to the business side.
Okay. And what was your own sort of personal goal on that? I mean, that the academic pure research wasn't driving you. Did you see yourself wanting to make an impact, and it was monetary, or what was that driver?
I think I definitely enjoyed the tinkering and the programming and the beauty of getting something and knowing immediately if it worked or not. But I wanted to get closer to why were we doing this? What was the decision behind it? What's the commercial reason? Who's going to use it?
Do you still code? Do your clients let you anywhere near their code?
No, not professionally.
Fred Wilson from AVC pushes code for Etsy every now and again. You should get back into coding.
I've done an iPhone app, but it's entirely recreational. I want to know what people who are smarter than me are talking about. I want to understand enough to have some sense of what the companies I'm working with are doing, but no.
So you were frustrated with the virtual desk project and you moved then to LEK?
I did. Strategy consulting company, we were doing projects, a lot of them were for private equity houses who were looking to buy companies, so it was about getting to know a business quickly and providing a report, talking to customers about what does this company do we think, is there something fundamentally wrong with this company, any reason you shouldn't buy it, or how much should you pay for that company.
How long were you with LEK?
I was with LEK for 4 years.
So Boris Johnson was also an employee of LEK, the former mayor of London, and he lasted a week. And he left saying it was incredibly boring. How did you last 4 years?
So truthfully, the first 2 years I found incredibly interesting actually. It was completely new. I was learning all about finance, about how to analyze a business, what's a balance sheet, what's a P&L. And it was going in all sorts of sectors, from medical devices through to semiconductors, through to banking and insurance. So that was great. Then they had this program where at the end of the second year they told me, if you wait another 6 months, we'll send you to Boston for 6 months, all paid. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And then I applied for business school, and my last year was basically applying for business school.
Okay.
So I'd agree with Boris in the long run. Consulting is great, but you never have that real ownership. You work on something really hard for anywhere between 2 weeks and 2 months, and then it's gone. You have no idea if your recommendations actually lead to anything.
And profile, so obviously you were doing a lot of different strategic work across different sectors, like you mentioned healthcare and security and bits and pieces like that, but the profile of the companies you were working with, were they all later stage, well-established companies? At what point did you start seeing the word startup float across your horizon and start getting?
Not at LEK.
Not at LEK.
It was, I guess, the only thing which was interesting, this was back in the late 90s. So a lot of the projects we were doing were for old established companies who were suddenly hearing this word internet and panicking and thinking, our investors want us to have an internet strategy, what do we do? And so we did do a lot of internet strategies which were completely ridiculous in most respects for an airport company's internet strategy, and how that was going to be worth 2 times as much as the airport, their website.
Airport.com.
But no startups.
Okay. So then you moved to ST.
Yeah, so after business school, I knew I wanted to get closer to technology. It was 2001, the first week at business school was 9/11. It wasn't the most, not many tech companies were hiring, but I was fortunate enough to find a job with a company called ST Microelectronics, which at the time was the largest European semiconductor company.
And you'd moved then, so you'd gone to Boston, you went to Paris, and then you were back in...
And that was in Geneva. That was headquartered in Geneva. And that's really where I got to work with startups and VCs.
Okay. Because the role at ST was...
The role was corporate development,
okay,
which involved really 2 things: strategic partnerships with smaller companies, as well as actually investing in companies or buying companies outright. So while I was there, we made 10 deals, and we probably I was there 3 years. We completed 10 transactions, and we probably looked at north of 100 certainly. And they went from an investment in smart card, sort of smart chips for passports company, which was a 500k investment, up to a 2 billion joint venture for a manufacturing plant in China.
Okay. And based on your previous experience, right, so you've got your technical skills that you have built up at that stage, but then you've got your MBA. What was the balance there between those 2 skill sets at the ST level?
It was relatively balanced. I mean, semiconductors were quite technical. There wasn't, so understanding a little bit about what the business units were doing and why they needed to make acquisitions or they needed to partner with a particular company, or conversely, when we came across a really interesting company and knowing who internally in the organization could do something with this great technology. So I'd say it was a good mix.
What was the process like in ST for making that decision? Was there a committee? How close did you get to the check, basically? Because at this point you'd been sort of an advisory, consultancy, and now suddenly you're doing 500k here and 2 million JVs. At what point did they say, here Tony, here's the checkbook?
So not very close is the answer. Without going into details, big organisation, 50,000 people, big fight between the group of the CFO, who controlled the checkbook, and the group of the corporate strategy, who was trying to spend the money. So it was a messed up political process, which I think is fairly typical of a lot of large organisations,
okay.
Often the less successful ones.
Okay. So then, next step then, 2005, is that right?
That's right,
okay.
Memory. So basically, being in Geneva and working with VCs, I got to know Index Ventures, which was headquartered there. We had helped, they'd invested in Skype. We'd introduced them internally to do some projects, which led to some of the sort of hands-free phones from Logitech with ST chips inside. We'd also done some co-investments. We looked at a business which did circuit design software. We introduced them, they invested. So I got to know the team there quite well. And what happened was I was a little bit frustrated with the politicking, as I'd hinted, and was tempted to go to a startup. So I went to speak to Index actually about, is there anything interesting going on in your portfolio companies where I might be useful? And as it happened, they had somebody who was leaving to go to a different fund. They had a vacancy intern, and they said, actually, would you be interested?
You wanted to join a startup?
That was my initial plan, yeah.
Wow, it's crazy.
And so I ended up at Index and was there for almost 8 years.
Okay. And at this point then you were getting much closer to the decision making than you had been at ST, right? So
absolutely.
They didn't quite let you hit the full checkbook, right? But
no, at least it was very clear, everybody was in the same direction. The aims were there, and people made rational decisions.
Okay. And the years that you were there, say 2005, 2012, take us to 2005, what was Index at that point? So was it LP1 at that stage?
So Index at that point had just raised their third fund.
Okay.
It was a total of 20 people, and the week I joined was the same week that Skype was acquired by eBay. So suddenly, in my interviews, they were saying, our ambition is to be reliably in the top 10 funds in Europe. And that almost changed overnight. Let's say after Skype, the perception was, wow, these guys have, it wasn't called a unicorn at the time, but they found one, whatever that might be. And so it was only 2 offices, London, which was just 4 people, and the main office was Geneva with the rest of the team.
Okay. And Index, I mean, they're a multi-stage fund or a multi-stage firm, right? So they would do everything from seed to late growth. And what was your focus at that time?
So at that time, actually, what they were really doing, they'd see themselves more as probably a Series A, early stage investor.
Okay.
So my initial focus, or what I was hired for, was to invest in semiconductor businesses, coming out of ST. Luckily, we invested in one semiconductor business 2 months after I joined, but that sector was rapidly becoming a graveyard, I'd say, for startups.
So you ended up in fashion?
So I managed to maneuver actually more towards later stage deals. So we saw that there'd been some interesting opportunities investing in companies at a later stage, at a growth stage. And so started doing that across all sectors, and yes, it did lead me to fashion.
Okay, so because your focus tended to be in those later stage deals, e-commerce, retail plays, own brand stuff, so companies like Nasty Gal would have been one of yours, Moleskine would have been another one of those. And how much of a challenge was it for you to sort of start getting into those industries coming from semiconductor?
It was interesting. I guess the easy part was now it wasn't really about technical understanding of the businesses, it was looking at financials, what are customers saying, does the business model work, is the management team solid. Those things were kind of transferable, and it was businesses which had things you could analyse. And to be honest, it probably suited my skill set better than the pure early stage, this is going to be massive. I can feel it. Kind of.
Okay. I think what we'll do now is kind of just take the speed down a small bit and assume that this is an education part of it, and say, let's do a venture capital 101 session, okay? Because we're talking a lot about funds, and we're talking a lot about late stage, seed stage, and we're talking about those kind of things.
Right.
Let's talk about what venture capital is, who needs it, what's an LP, what's a GP, and where all those things fit together. So.
Sure. So venture capital, I'm sure most of you are fairly familiar, but it's very simply the owners of a company selling a portion of the equity of that company in exchange for cash to a venture capitalist. And who needs that? I guess it's companies which are looking to invest that money which they've raised to grow the company further and to make something more valuable. I'd go a little bit further. Who needs it? It depends on the kind of business you're doing, and it's very much linked to the whole venture capital model. It's really where you have the ambition level and are willing to take statistically a 90% chance that it is going to fail, but a 10% chance that if it does work, it's going to be very big. That's roughly the venture capital model. I'm probably exaggerating slightly on the statistics, but not that much, particularly if you're talking at an early stage. Seed investing is when it's really the two guys in a garage with probably a nice set of slides and potentially not even a product. I'd say seed is now becoming bigger checks and slightly more advanced at the stage they invest, but that kind of idea. And then it goes, typically go through the alphabet at a Series A, which will be, I'd say, anywhere between a 3 to 10 million investment nowadays, through to growth investing, which, as I said, was investing in companies which have already established, have money, have revenues, customers, and they're looking for bigger investments and generally need that investment to go globally.
So you're spending this money with a 90% chance that it's going to fail. Whose money is it, and how do you go about getting it? As a fund, where does that money come from?
So I'd say the 90% is if you take all startups which ever try to get started. The ones which actually get a Series A venture capital, that number goes down to something like 50% roughly, make it, with whatever definition of make it. And if you take the ones which have got to a growth stage, what we find is 75% make it to one degree or another. Survivorship bias and all that. The difference obviously is, if you're investing in one which has a 90% chance of failing, if it does make it, you are going to make 10 times your investment or significantly more, and decreasingly. So when we're at the growth stage, you're only looking to make, if you make 3 times your investment, that's a fantastic outcome already.
Okay. So whose money is it? Where
so
does
the money,
come from?
so we've been fortunate to raise from a number of sources. It's typical of the industry: pension funds, university endowments, some charitable foundations, family offices. So we're missing out. And some funds of funds who are other intermediaries who manage money typically on behalf of those same kinds of clients.
Okay.
In our case, some of our investment has come from Ireland, so Enterprise Ireland and the NPRF, or ISIF as it's now known. And yes, and as I said, the university endowments all over the world. Most of the money's come from Europe actually.
Okay. And I suppose when you were with Index, you were involved, I think, in actually going out and raising that money. You were involved in the closing of one of those funds while you were there, and you would have done that as well with Highland, right?
Right. So more with Highland than with Index.
Okay.
With Index, the step was we saw, as mentioned, this opportunity for investing at a later stage. We decided, rather than investing all out of one single fund as we had done, to raise a dedicated fund, which was the first Index Growth Fund. And that I was involved in going to talk to LPs and explaining our strategy. And then with Highland, it was probably a much harder process than it had been with Index, certainly for the first fund.
Why was that?
We were considered a new fund, a new team, and it's very much a relationship business and a track record business. So you had all our individual track records, but not operating as a team. So people saw that as a bigger risk, and it's harder to convince people to invest.
I think a lot of entrepreneurs would get a sort of perverse pleasure out of the idea of an investor, of a VC who they have to go beg to, going out to LPs to beg. So what's that like from a Highland perspective? You're going out to a Swiss family office.
So let me ask you a question. Okay. Guess how long it took us to raise the first fund?
How big was the fund?
246 million.
Oh, 2 years.
3 years. So it was 3 years. It was, we probably did the same thing which entrepreneurs did. We did a database, an Excel sheet of all the potential sources of financing we could think of. Going through all the lists, through the conferences, there was something like 400 or 500 names in there. We tried everything: cold calling, LinkedIn invites, emails, introductions where we could to these guys. We probably had 200 odd meetings.
Over 3 years.
The usual kind of stuff.
Okay. So I'm a Swiss family office. I'm sitting on 50 million Swiss francs, and you have to come in and pitch me your fund. You've got to sell me the future, because you're asking a family office to put money into venture, which is an asset class. As an investor, I'm saying, well, look, I'm used to investing in factories and buying railroads, but this guy wants me to invest in startups, and there's a massive chance that I'm going to fail. How do you do that? Because you clearly did, right? You chose your funds.
You had to find the right people. I mean, we had meetings, and this is true story. They looked at the cover of our nice presentation. European Technology Growth Fund. Okay, technology, is there any technology in Europe? This was 2011. Growth, you must be kidding. It's a Euro fund? That currency isn't going to exist. So that was one of the good meetings. No, it was finding people at the right time, people who saw opportunity in the fact that the markets were fairly down, that you couldn't get interest rates on anything, and therefore showing them that we had these companies which we thought would be providing interesting growth. The way it works as a venture fund is you can progressively close additional financing. So we're incredibly grateful to the first brave souls who provided money. So the first close was about 87 million euros. And that was a big enough fund that people were comfortable to say, okay, you can go out and you can prove us that this is going to work. And that enabled us to make the first 3-4 investments. And that started providing additional comfort to potential investors, because they could actually see what kind of things we'd be investing in, the growth of these companies, and it made things more tangible because there was some sort of traction, some sort of movement.
It's interesting when you talk about sort of like going to people with the team's track record, because the success of a fund is an interesting thing, and it means different things to different people. I remember talking to a VC in Ireland when I was first getting into this game, and I was kind of going, how do you know you're successful? And he said, well, we've raised 5 funds, so we must be doing something right. And he didn't talk about the companies they've invested in. It's just, we're successful because we've raised 5 funds. So what was your track record that you were setting? Was it, we raised a bunch of money and we spent it really well, because I could do that?
So no, the track record we were selling was individually the companies we had invested in and what had happened to those companies over time. And so, fortunately, I'd left Index on very good terms. They were signing off on a letter saying, Tony has worked on these different companies, he's sourced these investments, this is what's happened to them, this one's IPO'd, this one's gone bankrupt, or whatever. Lawrence, one of my partners, had the same from 3i. Fergal and Irina had been with Highland in the US, so they had that record. And my colleague Sam had joined us from Insight out of New York, and again, he had that same kind of track record over the last 10 years that showed a little bit of returns to investors, not just raising money.
Just go back to the sort of the VC 101 questions again. Talk about an individual partner's, position in the fund then, and ask a very personal question, like, how do you guys make your money, right? Because sometimes funds, a partner will put funding, put personal wealth into the fund. How does that work out from an individual's perspective?
Okay, the way a fund works, we don't actually get the money from all these investors. We get commitment. That means when we find an interesting company, these investors are committed that within a week or so they'll send us their portion of that investment. The way a VC fund makes money is twofold. There's the fees which they charge. That's typical of an asset manager. So it's charged as a percentage. Typical number in the industry is 2% of the funds which are under management, and that pays for clearly all the salaries, the team, the offices, due diligence fees, etc. And then where the real money can be made if things go well is what's called the carry. So the carry is a percentage of the profits of the fund. So generally, once you've given all the money back to investors and a certain minimum return which they're looking for, beyond that the fund gets to keep, and the industry standard number is 20% of those profits in excess. So that's the carrot, but that's generally 10 years down the line once the fund has started making money.
Cool. So being on, as an individual, being on the, say, because when you go in as a partner and the fund invests in a company like Nasty Gal, for example, because you were on the board, you go in as a partner and you sit on the board of Nasty Gal. And what's that like? And how much of what you're thinking about is, how can I help this company? How much of it is you sort of directed by what the LP wants? And how much of it is how much money is the fund going to make out of this at the end?
So should have added actually in the last question, and in all funds, or pretty much all funds that I know of, the partners are asked to put their own money at work as well. So the investors want to know that you've got skin in the game, basically, that you believe in what you're doing. So sorry, that was part of the last question. So to be honest, it's rarely driven by the LPs. With the LPs, we'll have a meeting once a year now, reporting, and we have pretty much full discretion. Obviously, we can't go and invest in a weapons factory, or we can't go. There's certain areas which we've carved out which are not suitable, and beyond that, LPs have given us confidence in terms of what we're going to invest in. And clearly, we go in and we have that discussion very upfront with entrepreneurs. We're making a financial investment and we are going to need to give money back to our investors within a set time frame. So that's one of the discussions we have up front with the company. And generally, entrepreneurs, it's one of the reasons they want to work with us is because they also want to make money at some point down the line. It's not, if people want to just have a family business to run for generations, they're probably not going to be raising venture capital. And then beyond that, what you try and do is align yourself that what's best for the company is to grow and be profitable, and you have the same kind of vision, the same strategy, the same plan which you talk through up front, and you try and work towards that. I'd say it's always fine when things are going well, if the company is growing, if everybody feels that value is being created, everyone's happy, you have very nice dinners and very well done, pats on the back kind of discussions. And in some cases, that's the story all the way through the investment. Generally, there's ups and downs, and then I'd say where you can get into pressure is if you're sort of 5, 6, 7 years into an investment, and then you back to VC 101. The funds are generally 10-year commitments that you'll try and invest the money in the first 3 years, and then within 10 years give money back to the investors. So when you get close to that 10-year period, there's probably more pressure, and particularly if things haven't been going very well, then yes, there'll probably be discussions, and you have to try and separate your duties, your fiduciary duties as a board member, which is what is best for the company, with what does the shareholder need. And the way to do that is try and work with the other partners in the group, and making sure that it's not just you trying to be schizophrenic and arguing with yourself.
So you've a 3-year typical deploy time
3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years in which you spend the money. It takes 3 years possibly to go out and raise the next, depending on the size of the fund, 2 to 3 years. How much of your time is split between dealing with your existing portfolio, going out and talking to LPs to convince them to give you 87 million euros? And how much of it is spent actually talking to entrepreneurs and looking for new business?
So, full disclosure, the second fund was much faster to raise. So that was more of a 6-month process.
Okay. How big is that fund, the current fund?
That's 330 million.
Okay.
And that was having the track record, the same team, same strategy, same investors. We try and spend probably, normally it's about half and half spent between meeting new companies, new entrepreneurs, and working with the companies we've already invested in, and actually relatively little work with the LPs. In fundraising mode, that probably changes to maybe a quarter of your time is spent on fundraising.
Okay. So, room full of entrepreneurs. I'm talking about the life of a VC and how to be a VC in that world there. What do you look for when they come to you? What were you, and given your experience of Index, where they looked at earlier stage companies, perhaps than we're looking at the moment with Highland.
Right.
What are you looking for?
So, as I mentioned, the easy part is looking at the numbers. So, a business which is growing fast, which has revenues, which hasn't been spending hundreds of millions to get those revenues, because that also happens. That's kind of the check the box items. If a business has grown to 10 million in revenue, last year they were doing 5, they think they can do 20 next year, okay, great, that's all hitting it. Next is the team. So no rocket science here, but we're strong believers in backing founder-led teams and not necessarily hired guns. I think there's research which has shown this, as well as our own evidence of who really cares about the business when things go wrong, but who is willing to take it the whole way, and just getting inspired by the founders. So it's normally a combination of product vision, the pride for what they've built, the understanding of their customers, and actually just a raw ability to communicate what it is that they're doing and why are things working. We are typically not thesis driven, so we're not necessarily looking for, okay, we want the next cybersecurity company which is tackling this particular problem. Sure. Because we're at a later stage, we have the luxury of looking for businesses which are on that growth path, and then we also have the luxury of having these incredibly smart entrepreneurs who will educate us in why is the company working so well, and why do they think there's a big opportunity to make this work, tenfold.
I'm kind of fascinated by the sort of the world in which entrepreneurs and founders live at the moment, because the success companies that are held up, the sort of the Apple, so it's like the Steve Jobs, Michael Dell, Bill Gates. They raised their money and they built their companies in an entirely different world, and they're held up as being these wonderful entrepreneurs, and everything they ever said ever, even when they were buying coffee, is on a motivational poster somewhere. And I think it's quite unrealistic that way that's presented, because now we live in a world where a VC goes to a conference or is here, and everything you say is going to be tweeted, or an entrepreneur is living in a very visible world where Steve Jobs wasn't. Like how much of that sort of living in a fishbowl aspect do you think it plays on the current situation?
No, for sure it's an entirely different world from a tech perspective, I think. Reality is, in my mind, every industry is becoming a tech industry. Whether it's in finance, it's become fintech. Whether it's in retail, it's become e-commerce. Whether it's in, you name it, technology is permeating. So yes, there's a lot more noise, there's a lot more things being discussed, but it makes sense. Most of the tech companies I look at are really not tech companies, I'd say. If a tech company is somebody who's developing hardcore new algorithms, new technology, every company needs software. It's companies which have websites. Well, yes, everybody's got websites. Almost everybody has an app. So it's it's a very different world. I don't see that distinction between what is the tech business world and the rest of the business world.
Sure. So, going to change track and focus in on Ireland now, because as you mentioned, when Highland raised that first fund, the NPRF ISIF were involved as an LP.
Right.
And the conditions of that were that you, as the new kid on the block at Highland, had to relocate here.
Yeah, so
tell us a little bit about that.
Basically, of the 87 million, 20 million had been committed by Ireland. There was a program which was actually between Enterprise Ireland and the NPRF called the Innovation Ireland Fund. And the conditions were to invest that money in Ireland and to have a partner permanently based in Dublin or in Ireland, I think it was. So when I joined Highland actually probably a year into that fundraising process, so I was the last one to join. And
you drew the short straw, and they said.
And my Irish partner Fergal gave me a good sales pitch on why it made perfect sense for me to move to Dublin.
So that was in 2013.
End of 2012, yeah.
End of 2012. And just as an update on that, so that first fund has now been fully deployed.
That first fund has been fully deployed.
We've moved on.
We've made our investments in Ireland, and for this next fund, we didn't have that same condition. Essentially, Enterprise Ireland are no longer an investor in our fund. ISIF are, we're happy to say. So we've kept our focus on Ireland, but we don't have the strings attached. We felt basically as a right to our other investors, we'd keep looking at investments in Ireland, but we wanted to make sure nobody thought we were making investments which weren't the best financial return. And then it became a personal question for me. Obviously, I could have stayed in Dublin, but investing across Europe and with my partners based in already in 2 different locations, it made more sense to be based together with them. And from a family standpoint, we chose Geneva because it was a city we knew and we'd lived in before.
Okay. So 2.5 years are close there to that being here in Dublin.
That's right.
What was it like arriving in Dublin? So this is kind of like your exit interview. You've been 2.5 years, you made a massive impact, spent a bunch of cash and you left. So this is your exit interview. What was it like landing in Dublin, late 2012? Things were not super in 2012 here. And what were your thoughts been?
So it was massively depressed, it felt like. Although people, the favourite topics were property prices, that's probably not changed. And the weather, of course, which isn't as bad as people say.
We even have sunshine here now this week. You should come back.
It was actually great. So people, the stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason, I guess. I found it a very welcoming place. I had a free mandate, which was, get to know as much of the tech scene, as many of the companies as possible. So I landed and started making contacts, cold calls, emails to people or introductions from friends, and just had a lot of coffees. And at each meeting would asking, who else should I meet in the Dublin tech scene? Who should I get to know? So it was a lot of fun.
Okay.
Got to know a lot of companies, saw some very interesting opportunities, and was fortunate enough that one of the meetings led to being introduced to Jimmy Martin, who was the CEO of MCS.
Oh, so don't go to MCS yet, just a second. From a community perspective, an ecosystem perspective, coming from Geneva and your work with Index, which brought you all across Europe, when you came to Dublin, depression aside, property prices aside, what did you see here that was similar, better, worse than other sort of European tech hubs, if we can call ourselves that?
It's a very livable city, very compact. So in all my coffee meetings, it was very clear that somewhere between the centre of town, the docks here, and Dublin 8, I guess, was the whole sphere of where things were happening from a Dublin perspective. It seemed to be a bubble within the depression, the tech scene, so people were generally optimistic. It seemed to be where things were happening. Broadly, my impression was there's a lot of talent here. There's quite a lot of experienced entrepreneurs who've done it, who are putting money back into the system. It's not necessarily the easiest place to start a consumer business. And a lot of more successful businesses are actually outside of the circuit, that you don't really see them. I guess those were some of my initial thoughts.
So you wrote a blog post 6 months after you came. The internet's wonderful. I can go back and read these things that you wrote. So you wrote 6 months in, you wrote a blog post, and you said something similar: don't do a consumer startup here unless you're into gambling and you're Paddy Power. That's obvious. But you kind of said, you know, what you mentioned a couple of names, companies like Relax, companies like OpenNet, and you said what you think that Dublin or Ireland excels at is the unsexy niche technology business. And then you went and you found possibly the most boring technology company in Ireland and gave them 27.5 million. So tell us about AMCS.
So AMCS is a Limerick-based business. It started about 10 years ago. What they initially did was weighing technology, which you stick on the back of waste trucks to identify whose bin it is and how much does the waste weigh. And what they've done since is expanded more towards the software side and linking that all the way up into the management of the waste company. How do you plan the trucks? Where do they go? How does it work at the other end when you're selling the products to an incinerator or to a recycling centre? So there's a long story. A university friend told me, you should really meet this friend of mine who's based in Dublin. Met him, he said, oh, you should really meet this accountant who works a lot with startups. He said, oh, you should really meet Jimmy Martin, the CEO of this business, who happens to be in Dublin today. Why don't you have lunch? So I did, and that was the beginning of a beautiful thing.
So tell us about like AMCS at the moment. You said they started 10 years ago.
So
they're clearly they've since raised another nearly 50 million as far as I know.
So it was probably almost a year of discussions with MCS. That's quite typical at the growth stage. The business was profitable, didn't necessarily need money. So it's a question of building trust with the team, understanding where they might need to have money. It so happened there was one of their shareholders which had one of the issues we were talking about. They were very much looking for liquidity at the moment. They wanted to sell all their shares. And also they were looking at a business they wanted to acquire to give them some additional scale in the States. And those two things combined meant it was quite a long, difficult negotiation in terms of how the deal should be structured, but we got there after about a year. They did well. They made that acquisition in the US. They spoke to Silicon Valley Bank, who gave them a loan which enabled them to make another acquisition in Denmark. Now they've been integrating that one. And then earlier this year, we decided as a board that it made sense to continue the strategy. Basically, it's a sector which is so unsexy that nobody's built a really big business in it. There's a lot of small national businesses which have all the clients but don't necessarily have the technology which companies need as technology and basically what people expect from business software evolved. And they make very good acquisition opportunities. So we decided to raise more capital to continue buying businesses around the world to consolidate position as the leader. We introduced them to a number of US funds, and one of these funds, which was Insight, actually invested together with ISIF around $50 million into the business, and that was in August this year.
So that was your only Irish play from the first fund. That's been announced, I guess. So.
That's right.
And you fulfilled your obligations to NPRF and ISIF with that? But I know you can't speak too openly about this.
I can. Yes, so that fulfilled our obligations. I guess an added bonus was a business we invested in the US, which is called Malwarebytes.
Yeah.
They were figuring out where to place their European office. They were being wooed by Switzerland, and we sort of kindly directed them towards the IDA, who did a very good job, and they now decided to open a centre in Cork, so they've hired the first people there, and they're going to hire 50 more people.
Okay. Do you think that you're slightly open to criticism with the AMCS because you're under the sort of the LP. It's one of the few times you've got an LP who was, impinging sort of like, you must do an Irish investment. 27.5 million into a company in Limerick. Do you think people would criticise and say it's the best of what was in Ireland, or do you think that AMCS would have been as successful at raising funding outside if you happened to have that conversation as well? Long-winded way of saying very actually good.
I think we feel very validated by the recent investment round. They say there was clearly no need other than pure financial incentive to invest in a great company. I think what we saw was we probably wouldn't have looked as hard at the business if we hadn't been looking to deploy money in Ireland. I think once we made that initial step of actually understanding the business and looking beyond, the dreadful branding, the horrendous website, it's probably one of the worst ones I've ever seen. Once I started understanding the Limerick accent of the founder, which took me a while. Beyond that, there was actually a really solid and beautiful business, with some really, really smart entrepreneurs who understood what problem they were solving and how do you sell to these companies. So I think it helped us put the work in to understand the business, but once we did that, we felt very comfortable that this was a business which we'd have invested in any country, and actually because it was a little bit off the beaten track, was an even more interesting investment because of it. There was no competition, or there was limited competition compared to some cases.
Probably a good time, I think, to maybe switch the focus back onto the floor here, because we've been talking about very heavy and deep VC stuff, and I'm sure all these entrepreneurs in the room want to ask much more startup related questions. Top voted question that I can see so far is from Ed. Ed, do you want to just stand up and ask the question yourself? I'm not going to read it off the board there, but I think it's a good one to sort of open this discussion about from a more entrepreneurial focus. Go for it.
So I don't know if you read the blog by Jason Calacanis this week when he was saying that he was talking to a potential entrepreneur, and he just realised soon in the conversation that they probably just didn't have like the killer instinct to do this, to go down the route of doing a startup and understanding how much that's going to take out of you. Do you think it's hardwired in people that they can be a founder, or is it something you can learn as you go along? I'd just like to hear the answer to that.
I think there's a certain element of hardwired. Where I disagree with Calacanis' post is, I'm not sure or maybe he has that gut instinct. I certainly don't feel I have that gut instinct to look at somebody and say, you're not going to have the guts to sweat it out. What I will say is he is right, particularly if you are going for a very ambitious, 90% failure, 10% moonshot kind of business, and you're going to raise a lot of money. So you're going to have people pressure, whether it's your family savings, whether it's other investors, on your back, trying to make it a success. It's hugely stressful, and not everybody can make it. A lot of the entrepreneurs which I get to talk to at the growth stage, they are 10 years into the business. A lot of them will admit freely that, if they'd have known what a slog it was to get there, they probably would have never started it. So, for sure, it's not an easy business to get into, and not everybody is going to be able to put the sacrifices in which will make it work.
Any questions on the floor at this stage?
One question.
Oh.
Once you're engaged with a company and you take up a board seat, what do you see are the major challenges that they face in getting to the next level?
Generally, it's best put by the concept that a company which is growing is probably a completely different company, changing every 2 years. That was the CEO of Rakuten who was saying that, I believe. The people who get you to a certain stage will not necessarily be the right people to help you continue scaling. I think a lot of businesses we see have a very strong founder or team of founders who are generally control freaks, who have their eyes on absolutely everything that the business is doing, they can really understand, and they've managed to get the business to, whatever, 100 clients, 50 people, they know everybody's names, they know everybody's wives, they know everybody's kids. And it's getting them to that next stage where actually, no, you don't. There's people you cross in the corridors who you have no idea who they are, what they do, somebody else has hired them, you've not been involved in that process. We've had to convince people that actually, the secretary should be able to buy pencils without you agreeing that expense. It's just changing that mentality, and there's some things which have got you there. Those companies probably wouldn't have got there without that kind of dedication, that attention to detail. But that doesn't scale. So to build a really big business, you need to start having different kind of managers, probably people who are maybe a little bit more in it for the money, but who've been there before, who've lived bigger companies, and it's trying to integrate that and not taking what's good about the company, that culture, and evolving it rather than trying to change it. And that's really something which I find really interesting.
Thanks, Paul. Question there?
Yeah, Tony, can I just ask you about these unicorns, so-called, billion-dollar valuations? Could you explain to us exactly what's needed in the company to reach that, in terms of, say, P-money valuation, growth rate, what size does the company have to be?
So first disclosure, I'd love to know, because we don't have any in our portfolio, and we'd be delighted if some of them became unicorns. I don't think there's any answer. There's businesses which are probably pre-revenue or close to it, which have managed to get those kind of valuations if you have the right number of users. In general, it's paper valuations. It's well known that the investors who invest, us included, but investors who invest at those valuations are not buying straight equity. There's different kinds of preferences and rights which are attached to the shares they're buying, which protects them in different scenarios. A lot of it's hype, a lot of it's driven by the founders themselves, particularly in Silicon Valley. My friend, who I was in Y Combinator with, has just raised $1 billion, so I'm only going to raise money if it's at $1 billion, no matter what the terms and conditions are. It's noise, I'd say.
That point there is kind of going back to the question that I had earlier about the difference between an entrepreneur now and Steve Jobs, who was not in Y Combinator and was not on Twitter telling everyone about what a wonderful entrepreneur he was. So are we in a bubble because of this visibility of rock star VCs and sort of where's Newbie gone? And entrepreneurs who are constantly tweeting about how wonderful they are to an audience. Please tweet, by the way. Not say tweet.
So, yes and no. I mean, the big difference with those times is the number of users of technology. I don't know how many smartphones are around the world, but it's in billions, and how quickly you can get scale, how quickly you can build a business using this. So, can you build companies which are genuinely worth billions? Yes, you can. And that's in a time frame which makes sense as a VC investor. If you look at all this, how long it took Apple to become a $1 billion company, or Microsoft, or all of these, it just took a lot longer in those days. Is it a bubble? Probably, but the whole industry is growing fast. The usage is there, and until the music stops, and if things do slow down as people say they are going to, then we'll find out. But for the moment, it's what people have been saying for the last probably 4 years. And people are piling in, and these companies are still growing. So we'll see.
Questions? Yes.
Just wondering about some of the deals that maybe were about to go over the line but didn't, and what some of the concerns would have been that didn't enable it to go further. Would it have been the board? I know you focus on the founder, and that's a key focus area. Does the rest of the board go through the same scrutiny? Relationships, does that play a part in maybe affects the deal?
Yeah, so we'll generally do references. Try and talk to people who know or try and talk to the board members. Try and talk to people who know people in the company. Get a sense of what the people are like. One of my first deals at Index was we were looking at a company which was building fibre infrastructure in Paris, and literally 2 days before signing, we had the money ready to be wired. We found that the CEO had just been sentenced for corruption. We should have probably done more diligence earlier, but that deal didn't go through, funnily enough. That's rare. More generally, I think the overlying reason is, do we suddenly believe that at the deal terms which we've been discussing, we don't think we're actually going to make a good investment? And that might be because we discover things in due diligence, because things have been somewhat misrepresented in terms of the number of new clients or how they were talking about things. It's normally if there's something which has been a real surprise, which we feel we should have been told about by the company. If we discover anything, then there's a breach of trust, and you sort of think, actually, I don't really want to spend the next 7 years working with these people if there isn't that two-way relationship.
If you could talk to yourself at the point where you join Index, and again when you talk to join Highland, what would you tell yourself?
So, in both cases, how incredibly lucky you are to have the opportunity to enter this world. So I love what I do. I get to work with really interesting people. Basically, I get to work with entrepreneurs who are passionate, who are motivated, who are really smart, who spend their time educating me about their businesses. So from a personal perspective, it's incredibly rewarding. And the other thing is trust. When you hear about companies from people outside the tech industry, really pay notice. So a few of the opportunities which I've missed were things where other people who were not within the tech bubble were saying, I'm shopping on this site, it's fantastic, you should have a look at that. It's like, yeah, whatever, everybody does e-commerce, and then suddenly it becomes vente privée. Or that's probably one learning. The other one was, bubbles, looking at companies which get stupid valuations without any financial metrics. Pay close attention if lots of people are using product. So one of the questions earlier which was posted was the biggest ones which you've missed. One example was LinkedIn. We had the opportunity to invest when they were only just starting to have the first $1 million of revenue.
They'll never make it.
It was a situation where they had a term sheet in. It was a 200 million valuation for a company which was making 1 million of revenue, 200 times revenue. So that would have been 100 times return on our money, which would have been nice.
You wouldn't be sitting here. You wouldn't have said yes to come around.
It wasn't my money anyway. So.
Just to follow on that question, it's a good one. A couple of years back, I met a VC called Sven Lingard. Sven?
Yes.
The European Tech Tour.
Sure.
And I asked him what made a good VC, and he said it's one of two things: 10 years experience, and you're about 9.5, or absolutely blowing at least $10 million on the stupidest thing you've ever seen. So, are you a good VC?
Not yet.
Unless anyone's got any other questions, I think I'm going to leave it there and say thanks very much, Tony.